Today we're looking at the rules of assignment and delegation. Then we'll look at contract discharge and then at damages in a contract case. So first, with the general rules of assignment. Generally, the right to receive payments or goods can be transferred by the assignor to a third party, the assignee. The important part about assigning that right to receive payments or goods is notice of the assignment. The assignment has no legal effect until the obligor, that's the person required to pay, receives notice of the assignment. If that obligor performs and pays before receiving notice, then he is released from any obligation to the assignee, and it's going to be up to the assignee to go and collect from the assignor, since the assignor was negligent in getting notice of the assignment to the obligor. If the obligor pays the assignor after receiving notice, the obligor is still liable to the assignee. So he may have to go back to the assignor and say, hey, give me my money back, because he's obligated, once he's received notice, to make payments directly to the assignee. An area where this actually happens is in mortgages. If you get a mortgage at your local credit union, they may assign the rights under that mortgage to a larger bank, and they will notify you of that, so that you'll stop sending the monthly payments to your credit union, and we'll have to make those payments to the larger bank instead. Now, delegation has to do with transferring obligations or duties to perform under a contract, and that's not always something that can be done. For instance, if the duty to perform under the contract is dependent on the personal skills of the original party, then the law may prohibit delegation in a case like that. For instance, if you had a contract with a world-famous artist to paint your portrait, and she tried to delegate that obligation to the local elementary school art teacher, you see, you may not be getting what you had originally bargained for, and so that obligation may not be assignable. So now we're moving on to, how do contracts terminate? Well, they can terminate in either of two ways, either by discharge or by breach. A contract is going to terminate by discharge, either when the parties perform, and usually full performance is what is required, or by agreement of the parties. The parties could agree on a rescission, meaning we're going to undo the contract and put the parties back in the position they were in before the contract was made. The parties could agree to a novation, meaning we're going to substitute somebody for one or both of the parties. So somebody else coming in and stepping into the shoes of the original parties. Or they could agree to an accord and satisfaction, just meaning we're going to agree to some different terms and call it good. A contract can also be discharged by operation of law. If it becomes commercially impracticable for the party to perform under the contract, that may be sufficient to discharge their obligation. Let's say you had a contract where you were supposed to deliver some goods at a particular time, but due to an unexpected worldwide shortage in the raw materials needed to produce those goods, you're not able to produce them. That may be commercial impracticability. A contract might also be discharged by impossibility. Certainly if the subject matter of the contract is destroyed, or if there's a death or severe illness of one of the parties, or if there's some change in law that makes the contract illegal or something like that. That would be sufficient to discharge the contract by operation of law. Bankruptcy can serve as a means to discharge a contract. And then if a statute of limitation has passed, then you've lost the right to go to court and get the contract enforced. And so that effectively discharges the obligation under the contract. And then lastly, if there's been some material alteration of a written contract, that would also serve to discharge the obligation by operation of law. So what happens when there's a breach of contract? A breach is just a non-performance of a contractual duty. You've not done something that you're supposed to do. Well, there's some different types of breaches. An anticipatory breach is one that occurs before time for performance. So for instance, if you had contracted with someone to build a house for you, and 2 months before he was supposed to begin construction, he contacted you and said, you know what, I'm not going to build your house. I'm not going to do it. Well, that would be an anticipatory breach. He's told you ahead of time that he's not going to perform. And if that happens, you have some options. You can go ahead and sue him because he has indicated that he is going to breach the agreement. Or you can wait and see. Maybe he'll change his mind and decide to perform before the contract period expires. I'll also point out the difference between a minor breach and a material breach. If it's just a minor breach, that's probably not going to be enough to undo the contract or get you out of the contract. But a material breach is one that is serious, and it would be sufficient to get you out of the contract. Now, you do always have the option to waive the breach and say, hey, that's okay. I don't mind that you didn't comply. I'm going to overlook it and let it slide. That would be waiver of the breach. So what kind of remedies can you get if there is a breach of contract? The most common type is money damages, and there are different categories or types of money damages that you might get. The most common is compensatory damages, and if you remember from our discussion in tort law, compensatory damages are those that are designed to compensate the injured party for the actual losses that have been suffered. Now, that injured party can't just sit there and let those compensatory damages pile up. They have what's called a duty to mitigate. They've got to try and limit that loss. In addition to compensatory damages, the injured party might be able to seek consequential damages. And those are damages that go sort of beyond the contract itself, but that are related to the breach. For a party to recover consequential damages, the damages must have been foreseeable as a result of the breach. And the breaching party must have known at the time the contract was formed that special circumstances existed that would cause the non-breaching party to incur additional loss. Punitive damages, remember, those are damages designed to punish, and those are unusual in a contract case. You won't see that very often, but what you will see are liquidated damages. And this is damages that the parties have agreed upon in advance. They've included this in their contract, and courts will allow that as long as the amount of damages is a reasonable estimate of the actual loss, and it's not excessive. It's not a penalty. And then our last type of damages there is nominal damages. And nominal damages is what you might get if you've not really been harmed by the breach. So if it were a minor breach, an insignificant little breach, you might get some nominal damages just to acknowledge that yes, the contract was breached, you didn't suffer much loss, but here's a little something to acknowledge that minor breach. Sometimes money damages are not enough, or are not appropriate. And so the parties might pursue some other options, some equitable options, like rescission or restitution. Rescission, if you remember, occurs when the contract is rescinded, it's undone, and we try to put the parties back in the position they were in before the contract was made. It requires the return of any benefit that was bestowed, and we're basically trying to undo the contract. Specific performance is another equitable remedy, and that is just where you get a court order requiring a party to comply with a contract. Where you're going to see specific performance the most is if it's a unique piece of real estate, or perhaps some very unique goods that are being manufactured for you that can't really be resold to somebody else. Then you might see specific performance. We don't see it very often with personal service contracts. You can imagine if somebody is being forced to do something that they don't want to do, the quality of their work may not be the best, and so we tend not to see specific performance in a breach of a personal service contract. Another equitable option is reformation, and that just allows the contract to be reformed or rewritten to reflect the parties' true intentions. And so this is a remedy that would be used if the agreement was imperfectly expressed in writing. Maybe there was some fraud, some mistake, a unilateral mistake or bilateral mistake, or something like that. The last equitable remedy that you might get is an injunction, and that would just be a court order forbidding a specific act. And so that concludes this session on contract law.